Okay, everybody, so we last left off just with a quick look at an overview of the ways that we can get data into this data table, right, that we need to create in order to actually render a chart with Google visualizations, right? And this is a good thing. It's a good thing because we have multiple ways to do it. So we can see here we have something called array to data table, right? We can see how this might work with something like spreadsheet style information. If you remember, we looked at Mr. Data Converter, which can generate this kind of array for us. We have this add rows method that lets us say, okay, these are the columns that we want, and then add these rows with this information to it. And then there's a much more manual and I think, frankly, kind of confusing way to do it, in which we sort of set values one at a time, each specifying first the row and then the column number and then the value. So the one that we're going to use for this, because our data happens to be in a JSON format, is we're going to use version 2, which is the data table add rows. And the reason for this is that it lets us sort of really clearly specify what our column names are, right? It's kind of nice and visible what's happening. But then what we're going to do is use our for loop to construct each of these rows and append them to a larger array, right? So in this case, we're going to sort of harken back to what we were doing with our candy list when we were putting pieces into arrays. We're going to do the same type of thing here. So of course the first thing that we want to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a local variable that points directly to the data, and of course I'm going to open up my gun laws thing, right? So it's .state data. We remember this from last week, hopefully, right? So this is the actual array that my JSON data. So remember that JSON data kind of points to this curly bracket here, and then I need to say .state data in order to get at this actual array. So having done that, I'm then of course going to need to know how many rows, how many times my for loop needs to operate. So I'm going to say var num states, right, equals data array dot length. Right? And now we start to fold in this piece that comes from our visualization. So we can see from our example here that first of all we need to create a variable and we need to say new Google visualization.data table, right? We need to say give me one of those types of things. So up until now we've been working with some of the basic JavaScript stuff, our arrays, objects, numbers, strings, things like that. When we start to add in these libraries, we get a whole other completely different new more sophisticated kinds of objects that we can work with. Again, which ones they are specifically is going to be, essentially is what we're looking at right now, right? This is the documentation for the data table. So I'm going to go ahead and take this, and I'm going to actually just copy a few of these, right? Because I will change my variable names. So I'm going to say, look, I want to create a data table. I'm going to call mine state info, right? And that, of course, means I need to change that. Oops, I need to change that variable name here and here, right? Because I'm always looking at my data table. And what I want to do is I'm going to actually look at the state population in this case, right? It doesn't necessarily pertain directly to the gun law material that we were looking at, but it gives us a way to sort of get a good bar chart, right? A bar chart is for visualizing numerical data. So the first thing that I want my chart to actually have the state, right, not the country. Actually, as a matter of fact, the second number that I want is population, so that's kind of handy. And now we need to get into this issue of creating our table here. So they had one more column. We only have 2 columns. They have 3. And then we have this add rows method. So what I want you guys to notice about this, first of all, is that the main element is an array, and each individual row is an array. We call this a 2-dimensional array sometimes. What we're going to do is we're just going to say, well, look, first of all, I'm going to create an array. I'm going to call it, say, all state data. Right? And that's just going to be an empty array, right? Because what I'm going to do now, very similar to my sort of favorite candy and unfavorite candy back in the day, right? I want a place to put the various rows of data that I'm going to create. So I'm going to do that, create an empty array as a placeholder, and now we're going to get into our for loop, right? So var I equals 0, I is less than num states, right? We understand this. I plus plus, right? We're going to say loop through, you know, loop through each state, creating new row from its data and pushing it onto our all state array. Okay, so I'm going to create my current state, right? So var per state equals what does it equal? Well, data array, right? That's my data array. Data array I. Okay, so that's my current state. So now I need to create this row. Now, I have a few ways I could do this. I could start by creating an empty array, right? And then using the push method. So I could say cur array push, right? And I want to make sure that I do this in order. So the first piece of data that I will need to push is the name of the state, right? So that's going to be current, what's that going to be? It's going to be cur state dot state, right? I could do this, and then I could say cur array push, right? But so anyway, I would have to do 3 lines of code in order to do this. So because I don't have that many pieces that I'm pushing on here, what I can do is I can actually declare my array with, sometimes we call this, sometimes you'll see this in documentation as a so-called object literal. But basically what I'm saying is, look, the first part of my array should be the state name, and the second part of my array should be total pop, right? It happens to be total pop. So, right? So I can just do this. I can just say, look, that is the array. That's it. It's the state name, and then it's the population, right? Pretty straightforward, actually. Nicely straightforward, happily straightforward. Okay, so I've done that, and now, of course, the last thing I want to do is I need to, so this is going to be, so the first time through, this is going to be 0, it's going to be Alabama. Second time through, it'll be whatever the second state is down here, Louisiana. I have no idea why they're in this order, but so then what I'm going to do is say all state data push cur array. And then what I ought to be getting is, you know, for each state, I'll have one little array that has the name and the population, and then I'm going to push that onto all of them so that what I get in the end is going to be kind of this complete, this longer array that looks something like this, right? So I can test this, and I will test this. So I'm going to go ahead. Now, what we notice here is that, and let's mark the end of the for loop, right? End of draw chart. Of course, we haven't drawn a chart yet, but you know, we're getting there. So I want to check what the state of my all state data array is after I get out of the for loop, right? Because the for loop is where we actually add those 50 or 51 rows of data. So it's not until the end that I'm going to see all of the data in that array. So all state data. So let's go ahead and upload this stuff. We'll hope I haven't forgotten anything, right? I think I just changed that one. Let's find out. You see we are still doing quite a lot before we get visual elements on the page, but I promise you the payoff here is going to be much more exciting than it has been previously. So there we go. Oh, and there we go. And we see, boom, array 2, right? So we've got an array of arrays, which is fantastic. This is exactly what we were hoping for. And we don't really have to do any, we don't have to look at it, right? We wanted to look at it. Now, what we should be able to do, according to our documentation here, right, is just say, hey, add these rows. So because we have this variable, all state data, that includes all of the data from all of our rows, we can just say, hey, state info, right? State info is the name of my data table visualization. Add rows, right? All state data. Great. Now, of course, this might work, but a data table doesn't actually look like anything. The way I'm going to figure out if it looks like something is by actually trying to put it on the page, right, with a visualization. So fortunately, it's a pretty short step there because all I really need to do, and I can use these options parameters, and we'll see what those do. So we're just going to include them for now. I'm going to go ahead and just copy the rest of this code from the example. So we have this var options equals company performance, yada, yada, yada. Var chart equals new Google visualization bar chart, document.getElementById by ID, chart div, chart draw, right? Again, it's interesting because we don't have to use this sort of special indicator the way we do with jQuery in this case, which I realize might be a little confusing. But basically I've got my options, so some options about how my chart, right? Creating the chart in a particular div. Okay, so if we look closely at what's happening here, we see this document.getElementById. Now, if you remember with jQuery, we have this option to do something like this, right? First of all, our target div, right, the div we want to put this in, is actually has an ID of guardian bar. So our first instinct probably would be to say, hey, go ahead and grab that div this way with jQuery, because we know that we have jQuery. In principle, they do the same thing, but there are some subtle differences in the way that they do it that makes what jQuery does not totally compatible with the way that Google Visualization wants to get this information. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to leave it. This guardian bar thing that we usually would use is actually a shortcut for this. So you can see how much less we have to write. Otherwise, every time you use this $ parentheses to grab a div by an ID, you would actually have to write out document.getElementById, right? So you can see why something like jQuery was invented, because frankly, it just makes things more concise. But in this case, we need to actually do that. And then what we're saying here is, hey, draw that chart. Right, and they had called their data table just data. We've called ours state info, right? So if we go back here, we can see when they did it, they said they have this array to data table method, right? So that's actually a data table. They just called theirs data. We called ours state info. So we're just going to say, okay, let's go ahead and pass state info. We left our thing called options, and let's see what happens. Okay, and oh, close but no cigar. What happened there? This looks pretty scary. Value 4779736. And actually we see that the error is coming up in a library that isn't familiar to us. Actually, this is one of the Google libraries. Now, we have a clue and it says value 4779736 doesn't match the type number in column index 1. So if I actually go to look for that value, the place that I'm going to find it, as it turns out, is right here. This is actually the first element of total population, and what we find is, and this is actually a really important thing to remember, if we recall, this is a string, right, because it's in double quotes, and this is a string because it's in double quotes. But we told our data table up here that the second element of our second column of information, index number 1, was going to be a number. And so it's saying, hey, look, you told me to expect a number, you're giving me a string. Or at least it doesn't say that exactly, but it says, hey, you told me this was going to be a number, and it's not. And so what I need to do here is go ahead, and we sometimes call this casting. This is my manual way of saying, hey, listen, I want you to take this string and treat it as a number, because even though it doesn't totally look like it because of the quotation marks, I know it's a number. And now if I upload this, I should see maybe something. We'll find out. See, this takes a long time sometimes. The internet is slow. Ta-da! It's a really hideous chart. We're going to come back next time and just do a little bit of tweaking on this, but as you can see, we've actually got something generated here. So I'll see you in just a minute.